afternoon all, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us this Wednesday afternoon. We take this opportunity to welcome you to the second webinar of the byDesign series brought to you jointly by TiE Delhi NCR and QGLUE. TiE Delhi NCR is the largest and the most vibrant chapter across the vast TiE network of 15,000 members spread across 61 chapters in 14 countries. QGLUE is the design and innovation venture of QAI, a 25-year-old transnational consultancy and advisory organization. QGLUE's charter is to evangelize design-led practices and accelerate the innovation journey of startups and enterprises alike. byDesign is a design-driven entrepreneurship 6-session masterclass series specially created for founders, entrepreneurs, and business leaders who are constantly looking for new approaches, tools, and fresh case studies to create business success. This series leads to Ideas 2021 Awards on April 16th, which is a flagship initiative to inform, inspire, and empower design and innovation-driven entrepreneurship. These awards aim to empower startups to maximize their success and impact. Do apply for the awards today at the link provided in the chat box at the end of the session. Today's webinar is on how to take your startups to the next level with systems design and thinking by Kshitiz Anand. This webinar will explore how to enable startups to innovate creative solutions for complex business problems by design. You have the product, you have the market fit, you have a lot of things going, but then some things are not. Something is amiss. In comes systems thinking and the creation of a robust system design for your startup to succeed. This session with Kshitiz Anand, Associate Vice President at Paytm, gives you the tools to better understand your success parameters, develop divergence-convergence thinking, and make systems thinking a part of your reserve. The session focuses on systems thinking approach to understanding complex ecosystems and then leveraging design principles to design for them. At Paytm, Kshitiz heads the design operations team. He's a passionate design leader and has vast experiences in setting up and leading design teams across industry and academia. His approach is firmly grounded in applying the principles of systems design thinking to problem solving, product management, design consulting, entrepreneurship, and design leadership. He is also a proactive startup advisor and is often taking guest lectures and workshops on user experience, product design, and systems thinking. He's a graduate of IIT Guwahati and Indiana University. We recommend you type in your questions or queries in the chat box or the Q&A box, and then we can address the same. I now invite Mr. Kshitiz Anand to commence his session.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, TiE Delhi NCR, for this wonderful opportunity. And of course, thank you, QGLUE. I know Navyuk probably is not here attending, but then, we've had like some great conversations on design and innovation in India overall, and of course, around the world. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you once again. Thank you, Lina and Tanya and team, for putting this up together. I'm really inspired by the series of byDesign webinars that's happening. And of course, it's good to see, TiE playing a very crucial role in advancing this entire startup ecosystem, not just in India, because I feel that it's a global body. And at the same time, in India, across all cities, I used to be a part of TiE Bangalore sessions when I used to stay in Bangalore. And of course, NCR sessions as well right now. So thank you once again, everyone, for having me here. I know it's a Wednesday afternoon. It's kind of difficult to squeeze in the time for a lot of people owing to the busy schedules that we have. But I'm hoping this is going to be an interesting 1 hour that we have with us. And hopefully, even beyond the 1 hour, if you want to connect with me, have some interactions, I'm happy to do so over LinkedIn or Twitter or any other channel which seems appropriate for people as well, right? So without further ado, I'm going to what we'll do is we will not take questions in between. We will go through the end of the presentation, and then when we pause at the end, we can then have either Tanya, Lina, or anybody from the host also read out the questions, or if I can just directly, actually it'll be better if I can directly just take it from the Q&A box as well, right? So I'm going to do that right now. So quickly, yes, of course, there's been a kind of series of lectures planned. We are in the second of the 6 webinar series. Today's one is on innovation by design. And of course, there's 4 more very interesting sessions lined up. And I'm really excited to be a part of those as an audience myself as well, right? So today's session primarily is something which I have been working for. Maybe I've been a kind of a huge evangelist of system design and systems thinking for the past couple of years, I would say. Of course, I have been doing a lot of the design thinking sessions. I've done corporate training for almost 10 years, done a few sessions with QGLUE as well. But what I've realized is, design thinking has its certain limitations. And obviously, you need to go beyond that. And systems thinking, that's where systems thinking come into picture. Because then we are able to adapt it in its different capacity, not just in the problem that we're trying to solve, but also within our own startup as well, right? So today's session is primarily looking at 2 aspects of the system. One is the system for which you're solving the problem, and the other is your system within your own startup itself, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about those things, and hopefully we can do some discussions on how we at Paytm have been trying to adopt aspects of system design and system thinking into the way we work as well, right? Tanya, I think, has already told about this thing, so I won't spend too much time on it. But on the side, I also run, in fact, my biggest inspiration for doing system design and system design thinking comes from this, a nonprofit which I co-founded with my wife about 8 years ago, called Happy Horizons Trust. And we've been using system design from day one there, right? And the whole idea that, if you're in a nonprofit world, if you're trying to build solutions for social impact, there is no way that you can not there's no way you can ignore the system, the larger system at play, right? And that kind of set me thinking that it's not just about the non-profit world, right? But even for any profit world that we're looking at, or even when you're looking at, let's say, building your own startups, or building smaller companies going to medium-sized companies going to large-scale companies, at the end of the day, this whole systems thinking hat really helps us to maneuver, navigate in our journeys as well, right? So of course, that's so I won't talk much about the non-profit work here, because I kind of keep it more centric towards startups and the whole way we have learned from system thinking and how we have kind of applied both in my past 15 years of experience, and then since I joined Paytm as well, how we're trying to adapt it within our team system. So as Tanya mentioned, I head design operations at Paytm right now. Prior to this, I was heading design for Paytm for Business. In fact, just yesterday there was a launch event called App POS, which is the tap and pay version of, you can take your card. Every NFC enabled phone can become your point of sales device, right? And me and my team had worked on that, and it was really nice to see something go live, at that scale. And it's such a inspiring moment for every designer out there. So just a quick background about my journey into design, and of course how I've kind of been there. So I started in 2001 purely by accident as a designer, never knowing anything about design. Unlike a lot of people today who are kind of very assured about why they want to join design, or why they want to do design, right? Back in the days, 2001, of course, I joined a program which I had never knew anything about. It was just by quirk fate that I ended up there as at IIT Guwahati, studying communication design. So obviously you wanted to be a communication designer, and then of course web was picking up, so you became a web designer. And then I had a really strong interest in photography and film, and I really wanted to be a film designer. But then you got a first job as a UI designer. And then around the time when I was coming back from the US after my master's in 2009, where UX, the word user experience, was kind of picking up pace around that time. Then I moved more towards strategy and management side of things, right? So you can see this stark shift from purely individual-centric roles to kind of little more strategy, managerial roles. Around 2011-12, where I was heavily involved in, not 12, 15 to 17, where I was heavily involved in setting up the nonprofit. So really talking about a lot of impact. And then talking a lot about design in generally, right? I feel that, by doing webinars, workshop, lectures, teaching, almost every month I've been doing a few of these, because I really feel that more and more people need to understand, the value that design brings it into their into the teams, and also within startup teams, within large scale organizations, within nonprofit organizations, within university students. I think the whole notion of design is so important. So I've been spending some time in trying to educate people about that. Currently, of course, I'm a design leader, and tomorrow what the title could be, it could be different altogether. That's why I've kind of left it as a blank. But if you ask me, right, like, do I really know everything about design? I just feel that I myself, even after 20 years of being in the design journey, there is just so much things to talk about in design, right? And I like to, often quote this one quote that I often give in my workshops is, come to think of it, there is no discipline on the world that kind of impacts a person's life more than design, right? It's just about everywhere, right? Whether it's in your digital products, whether it's in your physical products, whether it's in your environment, whether it's in your homes, whether it's in your kitchen, whether it's in your transportation, design is everywhere. There's some form of design. So it could be, the fashion design in the clothes you wear. It could be interior design in your sofas, in the interior products that you have. It could be, product design, utensil design in the kitchen that you have, car design. So there's just design everywhere. And when I start thinking about this impact that design has on our lives, is just so mind blowing, right? So for me, I always say this was one of those happy accidents in my life, which basically got me from a state of no design and this continuously evolution about knowing design and this quest for knowing design. And the more time you spend in the industry on design, I realized that there is just so much things to uncover a lot more, right? Today, if we talk about, design is in a very interesting phase, with the amount of tools that are out there for designing, right? So for the craft side of design, where you are in a lot of, for example, you have Figma, you have, Sketch, you have these different prototype tools out there. That has really stretched the boundaries in terms of what is possible to prototype, right? At the same time, you have so much content in terms of the information available from the knowledge part of it. And then, of course, design has become a much buzzword in the industry as well, right? This, of course, was not the case at all in 2001 when I kind of got into design first time. I remember, trying to convince people that I studied design, and I was to get really laughed at because people really, no one knew about what design was, right? So to kind of make things up, I would say I'm a design engineer, just to add the word engineer to it so that people understood there's something valuable that I'm studying. All right, so moving on from that, right? I always say that when I talk to startup teams, because I do a lot of startup advisory as well, and often I tell people that you should think of a startup as a system, right? And when I say a system, there are different components to a system, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it's important for us to think of it as a system, right? As a don't just think of it as just trying to solve like one small thing or a very small product that you have. You have to think of it as a system, and a system which is constantly interacting with this larger system, right? Which is the overall the market that you are kind of positioning your startup, right? So that becomes like your startup is a system, and then positioning it into that larger system, right? And if you look at it, right, every single day we are interacting with different kinds of system, right? And often in that process of interactions, many times we come across this notion that the system is really like screwed up, it's kind of bad, and we don't want to address it. We are going to create our own parallel system. We want to kind of live in our silos. We want to create something which is completely against the system. What I've realized is many times, in order to amplify the impact of our work, it's important for us to acknowledge the existing systems and then build around that, right? That's something which often I find when I speak to, specifically because I participate in a lot of incubators where we get to speak to a lot of young entrepreneurs, where people have not thought through what the larger system and context is, right? They have the very good idea in mind, but the moment you say, okay, how does this play out when you are to, let's say, reach a new geography? Or how does this play out when, let's say, an external factor contributes to that particular product that you are working in? And people go blank, right? And that really makes you understand that it's important for us to understand the larger context as well. Of course, as entrepreneurs, we are all excited to create change. We are all excited to make an impact. And as a result, we want to create something parallel, something out of the box, something new. Yes, these things become like things like, so the system cannot change, it's pointless to change a dysfunctional system. I don't trust the system, the system is really bad. Often we are very scornful of this notion that, okay, why do you want to change the system? So there is all these connotations which exist, but at the same time, as entrepreneurs, I think the best part is that we have chosen to create an impact in that very system, right? So that's kind of a beautiful way of understanding that yes, there is a system which is probably dysfunctional on different levels. Of course, it works at many levels as well, but there is a system that is dysfunctional at many levels. Despite that, we as startups have chosen to really, create an impact in that system, right? So when you ask me what really is that system that we're talking about, right? So I feel that, any set of things which work together, right? As a part of a mechanism or as an interconnecting network, right? And it forms this whole complex whole thing, right? And that's what really defines what a system is, right? I feel that uh, many times many times we have to think about how it works together. It's a set of things and this whole interconnecting network, so that eventually it feels like it's a part of a complex whole as well. Okay, so and the other thing, one thing which I often say is, what really differentiates the human species from the animal species is this notion that, we have the capacity to really deal with the system no matter how it evolves, right? And in fact, if you look at the human brain in comparison to its percentage size to our bodies, the human brain is probably the largest in terms of its relation to its body size, right? So I think that's what differentiates a lot of the human species from other animal species, because we have this ability to think, we have this ability to adapt to that system, we have the ability to adapt to a context and a situation as it comes forward. All right. So as I said, our mind, body, and soul adapts to the system as it evolves. Now, here the interesting word to focus on here is it evolves, right? So imagine a situation where pre-2016, right, where people were still using cash as a primary mode of working, right, as a way of transactions in our lives, right? And then demonetization happened, right? And of course, an entire country went through this transition. Everything went from going from cash economy with the assumption that yes, digital economy will kind of kick in, everything will think. And a lot of people said that it's not going to work. But if you look at the trajectory of digital payments acceptance across the country, it has actually grown considerably. So we adopt, yes, there were some barriers in the way we in the way we look at digital transactions, in the way we look at, going to the bank, withdrawing money, getting things done. So our bodies adapted to things. And of course, eventually at the soul level also we adapted, right? So whenever a system evolves due to a certain phenomenon, there is bound to be a resistance by our, as a human person. But then the beauty of the human soul is that it evolves and adapts as per the situation, right? And similarly, if you look at not very far away, but the whole COVID period also in the past year, right? In the past year also, we ourselves can say that we have adapted to so many things, which probably were not our way of doing in the past year before the COVID had actually struck in. So we just exactly about a year later than the first lockdown when it happened. And if you can, I'm sure all of us here can talk about certain things in our lives, which eventually we are able to do today, which probably we had never done before. But during the lockdown, we were able to do it. And now we feel confident that, yes, we can do it even further beyond here, right? And what has basically happened is that our mind, body, and soul has actually adapted to that system as the system has evolved. So we all know that, for example, remote work, right? The fact that, I'm sitting here in my home with my daughter nagging me from beside, and the fact that, we are all at our homes also attending this session, the fact that this would have probably been a conference, like a venue where this would be happening, but now it's actually happening in an online version, right? It has evolved, we have evolved, and I think even in the future, there will probably be situations like this where we will be forced to evolve as well, right? So there are different kind of systems that are out there, right? Different kind of systems which basically we deal with on a fairly regular basis, right? Every single day we deal with different kind of systems, right? So very simple, straightforward is what we call a system, simple systems. And one way of looking at, systems and its complexity is by just to understand this concept of variables, right? Now, instead of talking about the larger system, even if you were to, let's say, adapt the similar concept to your own startup as well, right? Eventually, when you're just a founder and another co-founder, 2% doing everything, you are basically just a simple system, right? Where it's easy to say that there's a founding team, and there's a customer, and it's fairly straightforward, right? You build something, you have a customer responds, and you kind of respond to it, right? Then of course, when you add a certain, let's say, a new element to it, right, where you have probably, let's say you start getting your few employees into the picture. A simple system has now gone to a complicated system, right? And then of course, when you add something more where there's a lot of dynamic relations to it, for example, market issues where there is things like how does a investor coming into the picture change things, it becomes fairly chaotic in nature, right? And then of course, when you take it to the next level where things are completely dynamic, where it's this relationship is ever changing, where it's very less predictable, where it's difficult to predict something, where it's very complex adaptive systems. Now, complex adaptive systems often you get to see in the case of, let's say, wicked problems, right? For example, when you look at education as a space, or look at, let's say, healthcare as a space, where there is always this constant changing dynamics between the different variables, right? And it's very difficult to predict the change out there. For example, if you look at the whole world during COVID, is a classic example of a complex adaptive system, because nobody really knew, right, what was going to happen within the world at this point of time. And as the things unfolded, we were constantly adapting to that complex world that was unfolding in front of us, right? It's the same analogy that we can apply to a startup as well, right? So startup, which is fairly simple, purely founder, a couple of founders and a customer. And as I say, as your startup keeps evolving over time with access to funding, your scope keeps evolving, you get access to newer markets, you go from purely being a simple system to a complex adaptive system as well, right? As a founder, or as as a person who is doing startups, understanding this navigation as you get access to funding, as you get access to newer markets, as your product evolves, as your product ecosystem evolves, becomes a nice way for you to, if you have this clarity, it becomes nice to really go, what do you call, go step by step, and to be aware about what are the challenges that you can expect when you go to that particular state of a system, right? So when you are in a simple system, it's very easy, right? You have a conflict between founders, you can quickly change things because it's very easy to come to an agreement too. When you have a conflict between a founder and a consumer, the customer care is kind of very responsive. It's very easy to answer these queries. I remember back in the days when Flipkart had just launched, I used to raise all my Flipkart complaints on Twitter, and it used to get resolved like very quickly, literally knew the people who were running customer care on Flipkart over Twitter, right? Same thing used to happen with other places like Clear Trip, with Airtel. I used to do a lot of those. It was fairly simple because the startup itself was small, but as in system evolved, the startup evolved from its size, from its outreach, from its market size, from its product offering. As those things kept evolving, of course, the startup system itself keeps evolving as well. So that's primarily a bit about the system itself, and I feel that empathizing with the system is essential at all parts for your startup journey, right? Often we use this word, I'm sure all of you have heard this word, that empathy is important, and we all say that empathy, we have to empathize with our users. We have to, whether it's a B2B or a B2C product that you're building, empathizing with the customer, empathizing with the user, empathizing with the if you're building a B2B, then empathizing with the business is essential, is important. So we have always contextualized it to a particular entity, to that end user, to that end consumer. But I feel that you have to start empathizing with the larger system at play now, right? It's not just enough for us to empathize only with the what do you call, the user itself, right? So so as we move to a more gadget-centric connected world today, right? I feel that all of us, I think most of us here in the audience, would probably be building digital products, right? Like very few, I'm guessing, would be building, let's say, a purely service design world, or something which is completely non-tech oriented. But the fact that even though whatever, irrespective of what we're building, the world has moved to a more gadget-centric connected world, right? And the onus actually lies upon us entrepreneurs to question these new systems and solutions that we are building for its ability to solve the problem that we have, as well as the potential to create the long-lasting impact in the system, right? Now, the reasons why I kind of highlight these words here is that it's given that we are in a connected world today, right? It's kind of impossible for us to envision, until unless there's some other big bang that happens, it's impossible for us to imagine that we are going back to a non-connected world, right? The fact that it is a gadget-centric world today, if you look at data about our mobile phone penetration, if you look at data about our internet, access to people, access to internet that people have, if you look at data that, the number of smartphones that are available for pretty cheap prices, like about 10,000 rupees, you can get a very good smartphone, and people are owning smartphones. There is access to loan to buy smartphones. You can get a loan for like by paying 100 rupees and buy a smartphone for 10,000 rupees and then pay off the loan from over a period of time. So the fact that we are getting more into a gadget-centric world, I think there is, of course, larger questions of ethics and privacy and all these things that come into picture. But we need to start thinking about this new systems and solution that we are building, right? Because when we started off, of course, all of our intent was to solve a problem, right? We all say that there is this problem that exists. It could be in, ERP that you're building. It could be a B2B product that you're building, a B2C consumer tech product that you're building, whatever it is. There was a problem with which we started, and we are trying to, solve that problem, right? Now, what is important for us to remember is what is the potential for it to create this long-lasting impact in that larger system. Now, the reason why I emphasize upon the larger system is because it's important for us to understand we as startups don't exist only in our silos, but then we are part of this larger system, right? So if you look at payment ecosystem in India, you cannot talk about, let's say, a Paytm or a PhonePe or a Google Pay by not talking about NPCI, or by not talking about, let's say, RBI, right? Because they are such an integral part of the system. Today, something happens there, and the entire ecosystem is forced to kind of change and evolve accordingly, right? And at the same time, you also want to make sure that if you're a kind of a nice visionary founder, for us to remember that whatever solutions we are creating will have certain kind of an impact. Yes, there will be a short-term impact, but then can we start thinking and visioning of a day of our long-term impact that our system is really causing, right? And I think that really helps me specifically when I think about the products that we design, the products that I design, saying that yes, it's going to do something in the short term, but then eventually in the long term, when it becomes a habit for people, when behavior changes actually happen, how does that long-term impact, how is the long-term impact in that larger system as well, right? So system thinking in particular, I feel it's kind of essential. It's kind of this holistic approach that we talk about, right? To it's this holistic approach to analysis that focuses on the way that the constituent parts of the system interrelate and how systems work over time and within the context of larger systems, right? So I'll highlight a couple of words here, right? So which is basically, if you look at holistic approach to analysis, right? One thing which we often think about whenever we are thinking about, it could be, so before Paytm, I used to work with 1mg. I used to head the UX at 1mg. And there also we spoke about this notion that even inside 1mg, there was this, suite of products that we are working with. We're working with, let's say, delivery boys, the phlebotomist who would go to collect your samples. Then there were delivery boys who would deliver your reports. Then there was, pharmacy delivery. There was, the warehouse management. There was the consumer internet's, interface for the product that you're building. And of course, there's so many other products out there, right? So obviously you have to understand system thinking. What it does is that, yes, there are going to be multiple products out there, but how does it, what is that holistic understanding that you have of the overall system, right? So that the constituent parts basically, and how you are aware of the constituent parts, and also how they interrelate over time, right? Something you may have a relationship with a one constituent part, which is not very, amicable right now, but eventually over a period of time, it might become a very amicable relationship, right? And then, as I said, lastly, in the context of this larger system, right? I think which is also very important for us to remember that whatever your product you build, whatever solution you build, yes, you are a startup, you are a system in yourself, but then it has the context of this larger system as well, right? So just to highlight those few points, holistic approach to analysis, understanding the constituent parts of the system, how does it interrelate? How does it interrelate over time? So both the short term as well as the long term. And at the same time, what is the context within the larger systems that we're looking at, right? So if I were to take an example of Paytm as a system, right? And this is something which we have been talking a lot about, which within the design ops team, I talk a lot about within Paytm as well, saying that, yes, we have our consumers, we have our merchants, because those are two main, ecosystems that we work with. We work with the consumer ecosystem, we work with the merchant ecosystem. So Paytm for Business handles the merchant ecosystem, and then you have the consumer app, which is the Paytm main app, right? And then you have products which are built for each of these ecosystem. So there is, even though it's just three words out here, consumer, merchants, and products, in reality, it is a fairly complex ecosystem, right? If you look at the number of products that is out there from the different verticals which is out there, of course, Paytm being a super app that we have been building over the time. If you look at, there are probably startups which are, built only on just one of those verticals. We have, of course, so many verticals inside that, right? In our case also, having this holistic approach becomes very critical, right? When you are building products which are basically require, which are dependent upon so many different of these other systems, it's so important for us to have this holistic approach, right? One of the things we often talk a lot about, in fact, every single week we have conversations about how the whole government regulatory bodies actually are evolving, right? So just yesterday during our product launch, we had Dilip Pasbe from NPCI doing a small interactive session, and then we had TR Ramachandran from Visa also doing a session with their team members as part of the launch, and they are so important part of the ecosystem, right? If as a startup, if I'm only focused on my own world and not worried about other parts of that larger system, it's going to be very difficult for me to really create an impact, right? So for example, in our case, because we have payments bank, we have the payment services, then you have the consumer app services, there's e-commerce. Everybody, every vertical has to go through so many of these regulatory checks, so many of these security checks. Fintech space in itself has so much of these regulations that needs to be taken care of, security issue that needs to be taken care of. There's data collection, there's encryption of data, etc., etc. So it's important for us to understand that, like as in the system has evolved over the past, let's say, 15 years or so, that 197 has evolved. It has been so important for us to understand these constituent parts and then how they interrelate over a period of time, right? I mean, all of you are also probably familiar with the whole, the Google Play Store thing that had happened a few months back, right? Where the Paytm app was actually put down for whatever reason it was there. It was put down. And of course, that is a classic example to show that, even though we are probably competitors, but at the same time, we have to understand this interrelationship between these two bodies, right? Because if you don't do that, right, you suddenly stand the chance of, your thing going down for, let's say, X number of days. And that could be such a bane for your business, right? Also, I feel that, again, if you look at Paytm as an ecosystem also, it has evolved over time, right? Like what happened, let's say, probably the seeds of something which was sown, let's say 5 years ago, how it has evolved over time, right? So today, if you look at a person who was probably just doing a mobile recharge on Paytm initially when it started the relationship. So when our first customer acquisition happened, which was about just having you to do a simple recharge once a month on the platform, versus the same person who probably does ticket booking, somebody who also does a flight booking, somebody who does a movie booking, who does a, so I, for example, today I just did my gas utility booking, I pay my rents over thing, I pay credit card bills. So eventually what has happened is, once you develop this notion that yes, I'm going to think about my customers, not just from an immediate, first level interaction, first thing, but then if I am to work with them over time, there is a possibility that I can actually build a larger relationship over time as well. And not just with my customers, but again, with the entire ecosystem, right? So for example, today with NPCI, we have a very, we of course speak to them regularly because the regulatory norms, then there's RBI, then there's so many other Visa, MasterCard, all these partners with whom we have to then work over a period of time as well, right? And then you understand that, these are all part of the larger system, right? Where even our competitors, for example, are at play, where they also have, are trying to cause, there's this larger cause that they are going after to make digital payment transaction the preferred mode of payments for customers in India, right? And if that's the vision with which even the competitors or we are working towards, we all understand that there is this larger context with which we need to work with, right? So we kind of every single day, at least within my team and the design team, we kind of talk about this fairly regularly, that it's important for us to leverage system thinking, because only then that, for example, a product which was launched yesterday, my team had worked on it, let's say 4 months before, right? But then it took that time for the the partners to come into the picture, the approvals to come into the picture, and eventually then roll it out, right? So we use it fairly regularly within our work as well, right? So I often say that if you're a good system thinker, you're better prepared for the outcome of an event, right? I know a lot of people, we can take a lot of examples of, a certain product becoming popular during a certain crisis time, right? I think the biggest thing why that happens is when people are good system thinkers, when you really understand that, yes, if this thing goes wrong within my system, here is my go to action that I can do immediately to rectify that situation, right? And I think that really, if you are a good system thinker, you are better prepared for outcome of any event that might actually happen. The event could be a positive event, it could be a negative event as well. So for example, one of the positive thing happened yesterday when we got to know that the app POS limit, right? So the tap and pay limit, initially it used to be 2,000 rupees, right? Within if you have, let's say, a Visa card or a MasterCard, and you could go to a machine, a phone machine, you could just tap and pay for about 2,000 rupees maximum. During COVID time, now it has become what you call 5,000 rupees. What basically that means, it's a good outcome, because now suddenly you can have more, your GMV value increases for that customer, right? So the customer is being able to spend more, so your volume also increases, right, in terms of transaction that you are with. So often you have to be always prepared for an outcome of for any event, be alert about the event. And I feel that one way of keeping a tap on these these events is to have that good system thinking. So when you have that system thinking, you know precisely that, yes, my competition, the regulatory bodies, the funding bodies, there could be XYZ. There's government relationships, there is international relationships, there's so many things at play. So if you are aware about all these things by virtue of having this holistic approach to understanding your system, I think you're just better off and much better prepared when you really when a situation, any situation actually occurs. So I've often felt that in order to do that, often we talk about empathy being the core of system thinking, right? I think we often talk about empathy in the context of empathize with the user, empathize with the end customer. But I just feel that as a part of system thinking, you also empathize not just with your user, but you also empathize with a business company, right? The business team. You also empathize with, let's say, the investor, because obviously the investor wants return. So you have to empathize with them as well, right? So empathy comes in different forms. I believe that system thinking really opens you up towards empathy beyond just the user, and also to look at empathy in the context of larger context as well, right? I think all of you must be familiar with some things which are essential for empathy: reciprocity, there's trust, there's cooperation, which I think we all talk about empathy. In fact, just recently I did a small LinkedIn post on empathy, saying that it's probably the most used or abused word in the design lexicon, right? Where everyone talks about empathy, but few people understand it, and even fewer actually adopt it in their day-to-day lives, right? The reasons being, empathy means a lot about reciprocity, right? So there is a reciprocal nature of giver and a sender, right? A receiver and a sender. So if you give something, you expect something in return. If I'm empathizing with you as a customer, then I expect you to empathize with me as a business, right? So there's that reciprocal nature of things which is out there. Then of course there's trust, which often can result over time. It might be something which you build initially, and one problem happens, and there's a breach of trust. I remember a lot of people have this, when we look at our consumer complaints, a lot of people talk about, for example, they have been victim of frauds, and these are like not least in the educated, but people where you come from, let's say villages, where sometimes they get a victim of fraud, and their money gets swooshed off from their accounts. There's this immediate breach of trust that happens, right? And no matter what you try, it's very difficult to bring that trust back, right? And as we are building systems today, if you look at all the systems and products and solutions that we're building, it is going to be built a lot on trust, right? Like the simple thing that around 2 years ago, I would probably never use Facebook login or Google login. But even today, I still do it, but then I'm very, very skeptical about using my login, right? So how do you really build that trust over a period of time on the products that you are building, right? So I think it's important for us to, all of us, to kind of, keep these things in mind as well. And I believe that, our failure to understand these hierarchies and associated behaviors, right, is often a root cause for problems. And when I say hierarchies, I mean hierarchies within that larger system, right? So no matter how big a system you are, there is bound to be hierarchies. We all talk about this flat structure, But in reality, flat structure doesn't exist, right? So there's always, there's an investor, there's the CEO's office, there is, like what do you call, there's like a certain power users, there is, no-S users. So there is obviously bound to have these hierarchies which kind of, creep in, right? And I feel that when we don't spend enough time in understanding that basically is a major cause for problems, which then comes to bite us in different capacities, in an kind of amplified capacity later on as well, right? And many reasons why systems often surprise us when you don't have a systems thinking to your startup or to what you're building. I feel that, very often we are trained as young students, we are trained to think very linearly, right? Whereas in reality, we all know that the world is not linear, right? Like you could have, if you, the moment you develop a systems perspective, you start to realize that, to go from A to B, I did not go from A to B. I could go from A via C, A to B via C, and probably A to B via C is probably even shorter than even going from A to B directly, right? And those kind of things start to come in, right? Because then you realize that it's not always that the linear way is the way of doing things, right? Obviously, we often talk about, boundaries. There is, system surprise because often there's non-existent boundaries, right? Like we ourselves, for example, if you look at Paytm products, they are being used by, right from a tea shop vendor to a, ultra luxury retail shop, right? And it's very difficult often for us to really design products which kind of force ourselves into these particular user brackets. So in that segmentation of user itself, there's a boundary that doesn't exist. At the same time, even across the way, you segmentize your users, there might be, these non-existent boundaries, right? Often we realize that there is there is a layers of limiters in the ecosystems, which of course, sometimes when you're not familiar with, it kind of tends to surprise us. Often there is this, delay in a lot of systems, specifically when you work with, let's say, when I used to work a lot with the government ecosystem, there's always this delay. To get one permission, you have to run around for like 5 days, 10 days, 20 days, and it can actually cause a lot of frustration as well, right? So even though, we have to understand that yes, it's okay, the system is like that, right? It's not something which we can do anything about it, right? So be careful about the fact that, one is of course to be mindful and then accept it, and then see how it can, impact your work as well, right? I also feel that, we as generations, as Indians in general, we are kind of told to be very less risk taking, right? I think in the current generation of entrepreneurs, that has kind of reduced a lot. People are willing to take more risk, but I think, we are so rational in our thinking, we are so bound to the ways of thinking that we often don't end up thinking irrationally, and often, we miss out on a lot of innovation, we miss out on a lot of these out of box thinking, out of the box ideas, because we have this, lack of risk taking thing, right? So many times what happens is when you bring in a fresh irrational perspective, or this, maverick perspective to things, you realize that, and if you have the system understanding, you can actually create products and solutions which probably might sound very simple, but then you realize that, hey, we actually did this because we understood the system really well, and we are able to take the risk to actually go after it, right? So one of the things which I also talk about a lot is that whenever we question our products and systems that we are building, right, we need to also understand how deeply it is integrated within the larger system, right? So we said that, there is, of course, you might build a solution which is at a very superficial level, right? So something which you're doing it very immediate, and which is something very short term, right? It's a very superficial level. We don't really get a chance to, impact users, at a larger level, right? The second is kind of a midterm time bound. I'm going to be here. You can use this product for X amount of time, and then, once it's done, you are out of it, right? So for example, if you're looking at, let's say, edtech, a lot of edtech products, right? So there is an intermediate level. It's a time bound thing. So as long as I'm preparing for my board exams or for my JEE exams, there is a time boundedness next to it, right? Whereas something, when a product is, let's say, built from a long-term perspective, right, which is basically looking at a behavioral level change, right? So something like, let's say, a digital payment ecosystem, which has actually worked from a long-term perspective, and it has enabled people to bring in their behavioral change. So today, for example, when I travel to, let's say, any of the metro cities, I use zero cash. Like, as simple, I use zero cash. In fact, yesterday I went to Connaught Place. I was carrying literally like no money. Some days I would even carry like 10 rupees, 20 rupees, 50 rupees. I was carrying zero money. And I was able to manage my way through. Like, I started using this around 3-4 years back, when I would travel to Bangalore very frequently, because it has now come at a behavioral level change for me, where I know that I can actually kind of, make my way through by just using the certain behavior that I've acquired, which is by using digital payments, right? So always question, right? Always think, where does your startup lie? Where does whether it's at a superficial level they're trying to impact, whether it's an immediate level, or whether it's a behavior level. Having said that, it will, of course, you of course cannot start immediately at the long-term behavioral level change, right? For any product to be successful at a behavioral level, it will take that time, right? So often you have to, and that's the reason why you need to have that long-term thinking. That's the reason why this long-term thinking is helpful if you have this system thinking hat adapted, right? So just to summarize real quickly, because I know we're also running out of time, I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions as well. There are some key takeaways that I personally believe very strongly about. And I feel that, one, having the systems thinking understanding really helps you to have this good understanding of stakeholders, right? When I say stakeholders, I'm not just talking about, your startup employees versus the consumers, but also, for example, the investors, right? For example, government officials, right? For example, regulatory body people, right? There's so many other stakeholders which we often miss out upon. And I think it becomes essential for us to bring them also into that radar, and having the system thinking forces us to not miss out upon those as well, right? I personally feel that, the moment you adopt systems thinking, empathy becomes a way of life for us, right? For example, you're empathizing with the business. Today, for example, if a business requirement comes to my team, I can empathize clearly with them, because I know that for this team, for the business, this is probably of paramount importance at this point in time, right? So I have to empathize with them. There's no way I'm going to say, what, my users are not going to like it, so I'm not going to pay attention to your needs, to the business needs, because as an organization, probably you're at that stage where you have revenue generation is an important thing, reducing profits, reducing losses is another important thing. So you have to empathize with the business as well. Many times what happens is we go in a silos and we say, okay, fine, let's not worry about the business, let's worry only about the users. And that often causes a lot of problems as well, right? I personally have felt this time and again that having good system thinking really helps you to do better product roadmap planning, right? So and this comes directly as a consequence of short-term and long-term thinking, right? So when you have let's say a short-term vision, you can really of course execute. And when you think about a product roadmap planning, where you often say, okay, here's this MVP level, few products that few ideas that features that you want to launch initially, but then once we have, let's say, been in the system for, let's say, 5 months or 6 months or a year to 2 years, then we can probably launch another set of features, because by then people would have got used to a certain set of features out there, right? So what happens is your product roadmap becomes much clear, because you have certain conviction that yes, now we can launch this thing because the market is already used to a certain way of doing things, right? So that really helps you to bring in better product roadmap planning as well, right? And again, as I said earlier as well, to develop this whole short-term and long-term vision, short-term and long-term planning, often what happens is in that quest for pushing things out to launch, we are very short-term focused, we miss out on the long-term. Sometimes when we are too vision-driven, we think only about the long-term, we don't think short-term. And I feel a system thinking really helps us to develop this kind of capacity, this ability to really go thinking both short-term and long-term vision thing as well, right? Cannot emphasize this enough. As you all must be familiar already, that almost in every domain we have regulatory bodies coming in, right? Like there's regulatory bodies in the way you are creating content, there's a regulatory body in the way what you're sending over, let's say, social media channels, there's a regulatory body in fintech, there's a regulatory body in, let's say, news and publication, there's a regulatory body in just about everything, right? And I think that earlier you could just do away with it, but today you cannot do away with it. And understanding regulatory constraints, it can only happen when you believe that yes, the regulatory bodies are also a key part of our system, and we need to really empathize with them. We need to understand their point of view, and then accordingly design our solutions, right? So that becomes essential for us. I just feel that when we talk about product market fit, I think once you understand the system enough, your understanding of the product market fit also keeps evolving, right? So for example, we are building, as a part of one of the startups that I advise and I've kind of invested in, they have been working for almost like 6-7 years in the education space, and now they're trying to build a kind of an edtech product, right? but you know for sure that they have spent so much time in the system. For them to really understand the product market fit is really, really, nice. Right? They're able to understand the product market fit so much faster because they have spent time in that system for amount of time and also understand the system really well, right? So this really helps us, because what happens is if you don't understand PMF, you don't have a good product market fit. Obviously, you go through a lot of iterations, you go through a lot of redoing. You do MVP1 versus MVP2 and MVP3, and it keeps happening over a period of time. Eventually, it's just loss of resources, loss of energy, loss of time for everybody, right? But if you have a system thinking approach, you basically are able to have a better product market fit immediately, right? And that kind of relates also to the fact that your go-to-market strategies will keep evolving, right? Obviously, one size doesn't fit all, and probably what launched in a short-term thing may not work in the long term. But then it's an evolving thing, and I feel you are always aware, because you are aware about the market, the system in itself, right? So, for example, today, if the system in education, for example, everybody is talking about edtech products, everybody's talking about technical infrastructure to come in schools, and I think we all, when we're building products for it, we have to keep evolving around that. Understanding your brand positioning and brand building, I feel no matter what you do, if you understand the larger system, you understand where to position yourself, because you understand competition really well, right? You understand what the competition is doing, you understand their positioning, you understand their strategies, and then you are able to say that, okay, this is where I'm going to position myself, right? Or this is where we are going to position our startup out there. So it becomes very critical for your positioning and your brand building, because anything less than that or any deviation from that will put a certain different perception towards your product or startup in that end consumer's mind, in that end user's mind, right? So, for example, classic example could be, let's say, a lot of people say that Tata Nano car, for example, right? So when the Tata Nano car was launched, it was actually a very good car in terms of its build, in terms of its size. It was very spacious, but the fact its positioning was as the 1 lakh rupees car, and that actually killed a lot more, because people suddenly developed this perception that lower price meant lower quality, hence it doesn't go up to my status, right? So always remember that where do you position yourself, how does your positioning then lead to your brand building. Taking empathy beyond the user to the system, right? Empathizing with business, I spoke about this already. I think it's an essential part of our startup that we need to also think about. And as I said, always aspiring for playing a larger role in the system, right? So we all talk about growth metrics. We also talk about like here's my quarterly OKRs, here's my growth metrics, here's how my organizations grow. If you have the system thinking approach, you can kind of clearly define your growth metrics, because precisely what's the scope, precisely where to reach out to, precisely which collaborations you want to do, precisely which stakeholders you want to please, which stakeholders you want to ignore, where can an investor put their money in. So you understand all of those things. So when you're at that stage where you're already interested in playing this larger role in that system, your growth metrics can be defined accordingly as well. So key essentials, I thought some of those essentials, just to kind of recap real quick: growth metrics, empathizing beyond the system, brand positioning and brand building, go-to-market strategies, product market fit. As you can see, all of these things you already know. A lot of people talk about it, but the moment you bring in a system thinking hat to all of this, it suddenly put things in a much different light. And regulatory constants, short-term, long-term, roadmap planning, empathy as a way of life, and better understanding of your stakeholders, right? So that's more or less about what the whole thing was about. I think we'll open it for questions for the next. I know we have like about 10 minutes left. So yeah, so that's more or less about the way. I'm hoping that this kind of a premier, like a very quick intro to system thinking, would kind of force you to kind of think about this. And as a simple exercise, right? It's like homework that I love to give at the end of my workshops. As a simple exercise, what you can do is whenever you go back to your teams, right? Whenever you go back to your teams, maybe do a quick system design exercise of saying that, hey, this is where we are. This is where my system is. The larger system is. In that larger system, this is where my who are the key stakeholders. How is my interconnectedness with these stakeholders? Whether I need to put in extra effort there, whether I don't need to put in effort there, whether I feel that my energies are getting too much wasted in this particular section. And then once you realize, once you put that in front of you, it's such an important So as a part of my workshops, I often get that people to do where I make them draw the entire system design of their startup, and where they're forced to think about constraints, forced to think about regulatory bodies, forced to think about stakeholders, forced to think about how their interconnectedness and interdependencies on other factors play a role towards their success, right? I mean, like, if you don't understand that, you could be putting in all the effort, but then things don't move forward, and that's of course a sad state to be in as well. Right, so I'm going to pause there. We can take a few questions. I'm just going to open the chat window as well as thing. If there are some questions there, I can see some few Q&As in the Q&A section.
There are actually two questions, Kshitiz. Would you like me to read them out for you?
No, I can read them. So Sushmita has the first question. Sushmita Varaich has this question: that being a faculty, my concern is how to instill system design thinking among students, say undergrads in college. Well, I think Sushmita, it's kind of I feel the only way of doing it is by actually practicing it, right? So what I would really suggest, and I can say that because as a faculty, I have also taught at many places. The one way of doing is if you tell them that this is system thinking and apply system thinking, no one is going to do it. But let's say if you have every assignment or every project that they end up doing, you make them go through all of these things. They eventually, once they practice it over a period of time, multiple times, then they kind of adopt it, right? So that becomes a very essential way. So, and specifically with undergrad, it's kind of a little bit more difficult because for them the attention span is lower. For them, they are more concerned about the final outcome, the final tangible outcome versus the process part of it, right? So it can become a challenge. The only way of doing it is making very experiential, making them to do it as a part of every project, and that kind of also I have seen that kind of works in the past as well. Mamta has this question: system thinking is thinking big picture beyond scope of a small system and timeline and stakeholders. Yes or no? Yes, Mamta. I think for sure, system thinking. I think the biggest takeaway is, of course, this the holistic picture that we talked about, right? This holistic approach towards problem solving. Often, what happens is we get too fixated within our within our what you call project that we're doing. While that is important because you want to be focused, but at the same time, having an awareness and knowledge about this larger system is also very critical as well, right? So how does system thinking make life easier? Example, please. Yes, of course. I mean, classic example, if you look at, our products that we build, once we understand that, once we understand, the challenges associated with, let's say, for example, I'll give you a simple example of healthcare, right? So for example, if you look at the healthcare insurance which is launched by the government, right? Initially, there would be very few people who would actually get healthcare insurance in rural India, right? But now that people have access to rural healthcare insurance, because insurance may sound like it's nothing to do with healthcare, but the fact that people actually are buying healthcare is eventually making their life easier. And somebody thought that, okay, in the part of the larger healthcare system, insurance plays an integral role there as well, right? So, but if they had not thought about insurance, if they're not thought about that larger picture, then of course you're thinking only about your healthcare service, which is maybe treatment part of it. So you miss out on that larger thing. So insurance, of course, is a classic example of how it is actually making life easier, specifically if you look at smaller towns and rural geography as well. Kumar has this question. Would like to know how much technical knowledge is required in design thinking. It depends upon how. I don't think too much technical knowledge. I think there are different facets of design thinking that that come into the picture. Things from, like, for example, empathy. Things from convergent divergence thinking. Things like making sure that you you kind of have this larger picture. Making sure that you have this ability to brainstorm, think about problems, think about solutions, think about rationales. So not too much technical knowledge. I think a fair amount of knowledge. I've had people from completely different non-technical backgrounds take design thinking workshops, and that has also worked perfectly fine in the past as well. Lakshmi, where do we begin with by applying of system design in educate startup? I think nothing better than trying to map out the entire education system in front of you, right? Even if you just do that exercise. I remember I used to do a lot of workshops with school teachers, and when I used to do a workshop with school teachers, one of the first thing that I would make them do is, can you write me all the problems that exist within the education system? And they would just, go on and fill like the whole chart paper that there's so much problem. There's problem with the parents, there's problem with the teachers, there's problem with, school authorities, there's problem with students, there's problem with ourselves, XYZ. I think, just, and then when I would make them, see that chart in front of them, I say, do you realize that you as a teacher are, up against so much challenges, that despite all these challenges system, you are actually trying to create some impact out there, right? And that kind of blows them away, because suddenly they feel this immense self-confidence that I as a teacher can actually make a difference over there, right? So that would be a nice process to start with, saying that can you map out the education system, and then maybe even list down like where you think that your product fits in really well, right? Like even if you look at education system, such a huge system, right? Right from your the K-12 education to your undergrad, college education, to your after school, like after college, like upskilling education. So education itself is such a huge thing. Where does your product or system really fit in? And then what are its dependencies on? What are the challenges on? And you can really kind of work from there. Money has, where does design thinking or innovation fit into the whole process of system thinking? I think design thinking would be a subset if I were to kind of use a mathematical construct to explain that. I feel a system thinking is probably a much larger, wide, holistic thing. Design thinking, of course, is a certain approach. Design thinking talks a lot about certain things that you do in the design thinking way. Obviously, both of them have inspirations, probably started on the same time. There is, Nigel Cross, who talks about system thinking a lot. There is, Harold Lenson, who talks about this book called The Design Way. He talks a lot about systems thinking. So there are a lot of people who've been talking about systems thinking for quite some time. Of course, design thinking, I would say system thinking is probably even before design thinking became a buzzword, right? So design thinking is kind of what it has done is it's kind of simplified the whole thing into some very easy to understand, 5-step process, which of course is good as a first step. But system thinking can go a little bit even beyond that, because the moment you get to a larger system, right, where you start talking about every stakeholder and their power and their interest, when you start talking about every stakeholder and the challenge and the constraint that they come along with, there is so much thing that start unfolding, right? How does service design and business design start in the process? Yeah, I mean, like service design, of course, is a kind of a way of approaching problem solving, right? So you can approach problem solving where service becomes an integral part of your offering. I do feel that service design is an integral part, even if you're a product company, because at the end of the day, there is certain element of services involved, in what you do. So customer service, if you look at the entire picture there, if you look at, let's say, for example, a lot of times you're looking at sales, there is a lot of service design involved there as well, right? So, yeah, I think that's more or less on that. Yeah. So Lakshmi, Surbhi says, I want to start up in a sustainable home decor products, but larger corporate systems have fixed associates and partners which don't support tie-ups with small startup with tiny team. How to break through? Great. So this is a good question, Surbhi. Thank you so much for asking that. I do feel that many times you have to really then understand the problem from the problem. So basically deconstruct the problem itself, right? I'm sure there are certain things which the competitors, because they already have an existing tie-ups and fixed partners, I'm sure they offer certain things in a certain manner, and you might want to see that what is it that they offer which you cannot offer, right? And for example, many times what will happen is you might actually have to so compromise is not the right word, but also say that it's something which you can offer at a better or at a because at the end of the day, if somebody is going to trust you, right, why should they trust you to deliver that home decor products versus somebody else, right? So for example, let's say I have an option to do Diwali gifting for, let's say, my employees. I can go and buy them like a packet of, let's say, candles which are made in plastic, versus I can buy, let's say, products from you, right? Why should I invest maybe 20 rupees extra because you're the sustainable products? I'm guessing there's more cost involved. Why should I invest that versus not doing that? So then probably you need to probably make the story around, let's say, the sustainability story needs to come out probably even stronger, right? And the second thing also which I've realized is, once you understand the system, right, then you know whom to talk to within the system. So let's say you're talking to, let's say, manager, versus if you're talking to, let's say, the vice president of an organization, versus talking to, let's say, senior vice president, right? Your conversation would be very different, right? And I think that's, once you understand the system, you understand the people in the system, that can really, make or break your associations there as well. So yeah, so a couple of those things. I think we run out of time, beyond our time. I know we stop at 5:05, but been a couple of minutes time ahead. once again, thank you so much, everyone. I'll hand it over to Tanya and the folks at TiE for a quick closure on today's session.
Thank you so much, Kshitiz, for that wonderful and enriching session. I think everyone here will agree that there was no better way to have spent this Wednesday afternoon. So thank you once again for taking out the time and sharing your valuable and your massive pool of knowledge with us. A big thank you also to all the attendees today for being such a wonderful audience. I think before we sign off, I'd just quickly like to remind everyone that the link to the awards is in the chat box. So I urge all the startups and all the founders and everybody in the audience to just take a look at and see, whether you would like to get your startup recognized and rewarded for your design and innovation-led practices. Also, there's a link to the feedback form in the chat box, and I'd urge you all to take out 2 minutes of your time to fill that, because your feedback is extremely valuable to us. It enables us to kind of bring back quality content to you again and again. So yes, I think Kshitiz, you can also maybe share anything that you'd like. We'll be sending mailers to all the attendees today.
Sure.
And if there's any valuable information you'd like to send across to them, you could do that. I think we have one of our attendees, Bhavna, who's raised her hand. Bhavna, if there's anything you'd like to ask or share, you could put it in the chat box or in the Q&A box. Okay, I guess her query is resolved then.
Yeah, Mani also has a, I can see his hand raises, but I think we already answered Mani's question as well. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We had booked some TiE as well. Is it fine, all of?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Kshitiz. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you on the 24th of March for the third series that is going to be Business by Design. And we hope to bring you again some great content and keep you involved. So have a good day.
Thank you.
Signing off.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.